When we hear the words Siberian mountain mystery, our minds immediately drift to the snow-covered slopes of the Dyatlov Pass. We think of the 9 hikers who tore their way out of their tents in the dead of night, running barefoot into the freezing darkness to escape an unknown terror. But the Dyatlov Pass is not the darkest secret buried in the vast Russian wilderness. There is another story, a story so violent, so deeply disturbing, and so utterly inexplicable that the Russian government quietly closed the file and hoped the world would forget. It is a mystery that doesn't just involve freezing to death in the snow. It involves hikers bleeding from their eyes, tearing at their own throats, and violently bashing their heads against rocks until they died. In August of 1993, a group of 7 hikers ventured into the dense, unforgiving Khamar Daban mountain range in southern Siberia. Days later, only one of them would walk out alive. What she witnessed on that mountain is the stuff of absolute, unadulterated nightmares. The group was led by Lyudmila Korovina, a 41-year-old highly experienced survival instructor. She was a master of the wilderness, widely respected, and known for pushing her students to their absolute physical and mental limits. Her team consisted of 6 young, incredibly fit and enthusiastic trainees ranging in age from 15 to 24. They were eager to conquer the Khamar Daban Mountains, a popular but isolated destination near the massive ancient waters of Lake Baikal. For the first 2 days, the hike was a complete success. The group was making excellent time, laughing, and beating their expected schedule as they climbed toward the Retranslator Peak. But on August 4th, as they began their descent, the Siberian wilderness showed its true, unforgiving nature. A massive, violent rainstorm slammed into the mountain. It wasn't just rain, it was a freezing, relentless downpour combined with sleet that soaked the hikers to their bones. The temperature plummeted drastically. The wind howled like a wounded animal, making it impossible to communicate. Exhausted, freezing, and entirely soaked, Lyudmila made a highly controversial decision. She ordered the group to set up camp in an exposed, open location on the barren mountainside, rather than seeking shelter in the dense tree line further below. Some believe she did this to test her students' endurance. Others believe they were simply too exhausted to make it to the safety of the trees. They barely survived that brutal freezing night. But when the grey morning sun rose on August 5th, the true horror began. The group quickly packed their soaking wet gear and began to hike down the mountain, desperate to find warmth. They had only been walking for a few minutes when the hiker at the very back of the group, a strong 23-year-old named Sasha Krysin, suddenly stopped. Without warning, Sasha let out a blood-curdling, agonizing scream. The group whipped around in sheer panic. What they saw defied all medical logic. Sasha was standing there, his face contorted in unimaginable pain. Thick, dark blood was pouring out of his eyes and streaming from his ears. White, thick foam bubbled violently from his mouth. Before anyone could even react, Sasha collapsed heavily onto the freezing mud, his entire body convulsing in a violent seizure. Lyudmila, the hardened instructor, screamed and ran to her favorite student. She dropped to her knees, desperately trying to hold him down, to bring him back to consciousness. But seconds later, the nightmare spread. As Lyudmila looked up at her terrified students, her own face twisted in agony. She screamed, clutching her chest. Suddenly, she too began foaming at the mouth, her body convulsing wildly before she collapsed directly on top of Sasha's lifeless body. Pure, unadulterated panic ripped through the surviving teenagers. Tatiana Filipenko, a 24-year-old hiker who had run over to help, was the next to fall. But her symptoms were even more horrifying. She grabbed at her own throat, her eyes wide with terror, gasping violently as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the air. Driven entirely mad by the invisible agony, Tatiana crawled over to a nearby boulder and began violently bashing her own head against the solid rock over and over again, until her body finally went limp. 3 people were dead in a matter of seconds. Victoria and Dennis, 2 of the youngest hikers, turned and ran in blind terror. But they didn't make it far. Within paces, they both collapsed, vomiting blood, tearing at their own clothes in a desperate frenzy before succumbing to the violent seizures. Timur, the oldest remaining boy, tried to run the opposite way, but his legs gave out. He fell to the dirt, coughing up foam and blood until his heart stopped. 6 people, dead in less than 5 minutes. There was only one survivor, 17-year-old Valentina Utachenko. Paralyzed by fear, watching her friends die in pools of their own blood, Valentina did the only thing she could. She ran. She ran blindly into the freezing Siberian wilderness, carrying nothing but a sleeping bag. She hid in the dense forest, listening to the silence of the mountain, terrified that whatever killed her friends was coming for her next. She spent a horrific night completely alone in the freezing dark. The next morning, knowing she would die without supplies, Valentina made the agonizing decision to go back up the mountain, back to the bodies. She found her friends exactly where they had fallen. Taking a map and a small amount of food from their cold, stiff bodies, she turned her back on the nightmare and followed the power lines down the mountain. It took her 4 agonizing days of walking along a river before she was finally discovered by a group of kayakers. She was traumatized, exhausted, and barely alive. When authorities finally reached the bodies weeks later, they conducted autopsies. The world waited to hear what terrifying disease or unseen force had slaughtered 6 incredibly fit athletes. The official Russian autopsy report concluded that the hikers died of hypothermia and a lack of protein. Hypothermia. Hypothermia makes you cold. It makes you sleepy. Hypothermia does not make you bleed from your eyes. It does not make you foam at the mouth. And it certainly does not compel you to violently bash your own head against a rock until your skull fractures. The official explanation was a blatant insulting cover-up. But if it wasn't the cold, what killed them? Some researchers point to a terrifying natural phenomenon known as infrasound. Low-frequency sound waves generated by high winds funneled through the mountain passes. These waves, entirely inaudible to the human ear, are scientifically proven to cause extreme panic, severe nausea, and intense dread. But could they cause bleeding from the eyes? Unlikely. Others believe the hikers accidentally consumed a highly toxic plant, perhaps confusing a deadly root for a safe, edible one, leading to massive simultaneous neurological failure. But the most chilling, and perhaps most plausible theory, points directly to the Russian military. The symptoms, bleeding from the eyes, heavy foaming at the mouth, violent respiratory failure, and agonizing convulsions, are the exact textbook symptoms of exposure to a military-grade nerve agent. Many believe the hikers unwittingly walked into a highly classified chemical weapons testing zone, Or perhaps the intense rainstorm washed a massive hidden dump of lethal toxic waste down the mountain, creating an invisible deadly vapor cloud that the hikers walked directly into. The Russian government sealed the files. Valentina, the sole survivor, has rarely spoken of the incident, living the rest of her life haunted by the screams of her friends. We may never know what truly happened on August 5th, 1993. The Khamar Daban Mountains stand silent, keeping their dark, bloody secrets buried under the snow. Some places on this earth do not want us there, and they will kill us to prove it. Subscribe to join us on the next investigation into the archives of blood.